A house divided. The Langston estate was a fortress of wealth, but inside its walls, unease had begun to seep through the cracks like water through marble. Emma's voice, fragile though it was, had broken the long silence, and the aftershocks rippled through every corner of the mansion. For Carter, it was a miracle tainted by pride. For Maya, it was both triumph and heartbreak, because the sound that should have bound her to the child also served as a reminder of the fragile thread on which her future here now hung. Emma herself seemed changed. Where she once moved like a ghost, her steps were now quicker, her eyes brighter, as though each whispered Maya had stitched a piece of her lost childhood back together. But even as hope stirred, the undercurrent of tension between her father and her caretaker grew heavier with each passing hour. At breakfast, the following morning, the silence that usually hung between Carter and his daughter was replaced with something different. Not conversation, but expectancy. Emma glanced toward the doorway every few minutes, her lips parting as though she might call for Maya again. Carter, seated at the head of the table, noticed every flicker of her eyes, every shift of her small hands. He tried to draw her attention with soft questions. "Would you like more juice, sweetheart? Or do you want to go to the garden later?" But Emma remained withdrawn, responding only with a slow shake of her head. She was waiting for Maya, and Carter, though he would never admit it aloud, felt the sting of jealousy. Maya's private battle Maya remained in her room for much of that morning, uncertain whether she would even be allowed to continue in the house after the confrontation. Her ribs still ached from Carter's shove, and every breath reminded her of the humiliation she had endured. But the memory of Emma's trembling voice, the way she had spoken her name as though it was a lifeline, kept her rooted to the mansion despite the ache in her body and pride. She sat at the small desk by the window, staring out at the gardens below. Children should have been playing there, chasing butterflies or kicking balls across the grass, but Emma never ventured outside unless coaxed, and even then she lingered close to the shadows. The estate was large enough to be a kingdom, but for Emma, it was simply another prison. Maya traced her fingers along the scarred wooden surface of the desk, her mind drifting back to her own past. She had once believed her white coat was armor, that her medical degree was proof she belonged in the world of healers and innovators. She had fought her way through poverty, through endless nights of studying in cramped apartments, through professors who doubted her. She had been the first in her family to graduate from college, the first to wear a stethoscope proudly around her neck, but none of that had protected her when whispers turned into accusations. One mother's false complaint, backed by the unspoken bias of a hospital board more eager to appease wealthy donors than protect truth, had shattered her career. She could still hear the words, "We've decided to suspend your license until further notice." Until further notice. The cruelest phrase because it held no end, no closure. It was limbo disguised as procedure. Carter's memories. That evening, Carter retreated once more into his study, his sanctuary from emotions he did not wish to face. The shelves lined with awards and accolades did little to soothe him, nor did the large screens flashing stock updates. None of it mattered when the sound of his daughter's fragile voice lingered in his mind, reminding him that all his wealth, all his achievements, meant nothing in the face of her silence. He remembered the day Emma stopped speaking, how she had been playing in the garden when her mother collapsed, how Emma's small hands had tugged helplessly at her dress, unable to wake her, how paramedics had rushed in, their radios crackling, while Carter himself had been on a conference call across the world. By the time he arrived, it was too late. His wife was gone, and Emma's voice had vanished with her. The trauma had sealed her lips like a lock, and no amount of therapy or coaxing had undone it. Carter had thrown money at every possible solution, desperate to fix what was broken, but his daughter had remained silent. He often told himself that Emma's muteness was a medical issue, something clinical and detached. But in his heart, he knew the truth. She had closed herself off because of loss, because the one person she trusted most had been torn away, and perhaps because her father had not been there when it happened. That guilt had never left him, though he buried it beneath deals and headlines. Seeing Emma speak Maya's name stirred those old wounds, because it reminded him that healing could not be bought, and that perhaps Emma's silence had always been waiting for someone like Maya, someone willing to sit in the shadows and simply listen. A fragile truce later. That night, Carter summoned Maya to the study. She entered cautiously, unsure if she was walking into another storm. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk, his expression unreadable. "Sit," he said, his voice controlled but tight. Maya lowered herself into the seat, her hands folded in her lap. Her posture calm despite the unease twisting inside her. Carter leaned back, studying her as though she were a puzzle he could not solve. "My daughter spoke yesterday," he began, his words deliberate. "She has not spoken in 2 years. And the first name she says, your name." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Do you have any idea what that does to a father?" Maya held his gaze unflinching. "I know what it means to a child," she replied softly. "It means she feels safe. It means she trusts me." Carter bristled, his pride flaring at the implication that Emma did not feel safe with him. "I am her father," he snapped. "Everything I do is for her. And yet she has remained silent until now," Maya said quietly. The words were not meant as an accusation, but they landed like one. Carter's hand curled into a fist on the desk, but he did not lash out. Instead, he exhaled sharply, forcing himself to regain control. "I don't trust you," he admitted finally, his voice low. "But I cannot ignore what I've seen. Emma, she needs something from you, something I can't give." He swallowed hard, the words bitter on his tongue. "So I will allow you to stay. But understand this, you are on trial. One mistake and you are gone. Do you understand me?" Maya inclined her head, her expression calm but resolute. "I understand, and I will not fail her." For the first time, Carter saw something in her eyes that unsettled him. Not defiance, not submission, but quiet strength. It was the kind of strength he had never been able to command with money or power, and it unnerved him. The confrontation at the staircase, the silence that followed Emma's voice, was unlike any other silence the Langston estate had ever known. It was not the heavy quiet that usually pressed down on the walls, nor the muted stillness of a child who had forgotten how to speak. It was a silence so charged with astonishment and trembling hope that even the air seemed to pause. Carter stood at the top of the stairs, one hand gripping the polished railing as though it might steady the storm inside him. His daughter, his mute, unreachable daughter, had spoken. Not just a faint murmur, not a random sound, but a name, spoken with intention and recognition. And the name was not his. The sting of that truth cut deeper than a knife. He looked from Emma's glowing face to Maya's stunned figure, her suitcase abandoned by the door. He wanted to demand an explanation, to reassert control, to remind them both of the authority he wielded in this house. But his tongue felt heavy, his mind still reeling from the undeniable miracle he had just witnessed. Emma, unaware of the turmoil in her father's chest, repeated the name again, her small voice growing stronger as though each repetition unlocked more of the voice that had been hidden for years. Maya. Maya's body ached to move forward, to scoop Emma into her arms and reassure her that she would not vanish, that she would never abandon her now that her voice had returned. But the memory of Carter's hand shoving her, the bruise still throbbing across her ribs, reminded her of the danger. She could not forget the rage that had flashed in his eyes, the venom in his words. She stood frozen, her heart caught between love for the child and fear of the man who controlled her fate. Carter descended the stairs slowly, his footsteps echoing in the marble hallway. Each step felt like a verdict, and when he reached the bottom, his eyes locked with Maya's, dark and conflicted. "How?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. "What did you do to her?" His words were not the grateful exclamation of a father witnessing a miracle. They were laced with suspicion, with the desperate need to maintain control. Maya straightened her spine despite the ache in her body. "I did nothing but care for her," she said firmly. "I gave her gentleness when the world gave her fear. I listened when no one else did. And when she was thirsty, I gave her something safe to drink." Carter's lips tightened, but Emma tugged at his sleeve, her hazel eyes pleading as she whispered once more, "Maya." For the first time in years, Carter felt his authority bending, not to shareholders or rivals, but to a 5-year-old child whose first word in years was the name of the woman he had nearly thrown away. Maya's decision that night. Maya sat on the edge of her bed, her suitcase still waiting near the door. She had not left, though every rational thought told her she should have walked away while she had the chance. The Langston estate was a gilded cage, beautiful on the outside but suffocating within, and she knew how quickly Carter's temper could flare. Yet Emma's voice lingered in her ears, soft but undeniable, and it rooted her to the house in a way pride and fear could not erase. She thought of her grandmother's remedies, of the times she had watched children recover from nightmares simply because someone had whispered to them that they were safe. She thought of the hospital halls she had once walked, of the children who had trusted her with their fragile lives. She thought of how easily her license had been taken, and how long she had lived in silence, not unlike Emma. Was this, she wondered, her chance to redeem not just a child, but herself? She folded her hands in her lap and let the memories wash over her. She saw the committee room again, the cold faces that had decided her future with a few strokes of a pen. She remembered leaving the hospital with her white coat folded under her arm, feeling as though the walls had closed in on her. For years, she had survived on odd jobs, tutoring, and finally caregiving. She had told herself she was content, but Emma's whispered Maya had shattered that illusion. In that moment, she realized she still longed to heal, still longed to be the person she was meant to be. Perhaps this was why fate had brought her here, into the life of a billionaire's daughter locked in silence. Yet doubts gnawed at her resolve. Carter had made it clear she was unwelcome, and the power he wielded could crush her as easily as those hospital committees had. She was a guest in his world, one step away from being branded a fraud again. And still, Emma's voice anchored her. She could not walk away now. Even if she left tomorrow, she would spend the rest of her life haunted by that child's first word, spoken not to her father, not to her doctors, but to her. Closing her eyes, Maya whispered a prayer into the darkness, not asking for strength for herself, but for the child who had finally broken her silence. Carter's long night down the hall. Carter sat in his study with the lights dimmed, staring at the vial of brownish liquid still sitting on his desk. He had run every possible scenario in his mind. Could the liquid have triggered Emma's voice? Was it some untested herbal concoction? Was Maya a charlatan who had stumbled into luck? Or was there something deeper at work? Something no specialist had been able to provide, something money could not buy. The questions circled him like vultures, but beneath them lay the one truth he could not deny. Emma had spoken Maya's name. Carter prided himself on logic and control. He had built his fortune on algorithms, on predictive models, on the certainty that data could conquer chaos. But fatherhood had defied every formula he had relied on. Emma's silence had been a wound he could not heal with money or innovation, and it terrified him more than any business loss ever could. Seeing her voice return in the presence of a woman he distrusted felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in, and yet, as he replayed the moment in his mind, he could not shake the sight of Emma's glowing eyes as she whispered, "Maya." It was not manipulation. It was not chance. It was the pure, unfiltered trust of a child. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, but the drink offered no comfort. Pride urged him to dismiss the event as coincidence, to send Maya away as planned, to reclaim control of his household. But a quieter voice, a voice he rarely allowed himself to hear, suggested something else. What if Maya was the key? What if the woman he had shoved to the ground in anger was the one person who could give him back the daughter he had lost to silence? The thought unsettled him. Carter Langston did not like owing anyone, least of all a woman he had insulted and demeaned. But Emma's voice was undeniable, and he could not ignore the possibility that for once, his wealth and power were not the answer. He sat back in his chair, staring at the shadows dancing on the wall, and for the first time in years, he admitted to himself that he was afraid, not of failure in business, not of losing status, but of losing the one thing he could not replace, his daughter's chance at a normal life. The dawn of a new voice. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the mansion, gilding the oak panels and velvet drapes with deceptive warmth. Maya stood by her packed suitcase, ready to leave if Carter demanded it, though every part of her body resisted the thought. She braced herself for his wrath, for the final dismissal that would send her back into the uncertain world beyond the estate's gates. Yet before Carter appeared, Emma slipped into her room quietly, her small hands tugging at Maya's sleeve. The little girl's lips trembled, and then, with visible effort, she whispered again, "Maya." This time, the word was not a faint murmur, but a fragile declaration, carrying with it the weight of 2 years of silence broken. Maya dropped to her knees, pulling Emma gently into her arms, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. "I'm here, sweetheart," she whispered, holding her close. "I'm not going anywhere." The child buried her face in Maya's shoulder, And for the first time in a long time, the silence of the house was broken by something more powerful than wealth or fear. It was broken by the fragile, miraculous sound of a child reclaiming her voice. At the doorway, Carter watched unseen, his expression unreadable. Pride still warred with fear, but even he could not deny what his eyes witnessed. His daughter, who had refused to speak to anyone for years, had chosen this woman, this outsider, as the one worthy of her first words. The walls of the Langston estate had heard many things: business deals, parties, arguments, but now they carried the echo of a name that would change everything. The silence that had ruled the household for years had been broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of wealth. Carter Langston stood rigid in the middle of his ornate drawing room, the vial still clutched in his hand like a piece of evidence in a courtroom. The liquid inside shimmered faintly under the chandelier, harmless in appearance, but in his mind it had become the symbol of every fear he carried as a father. He had spent millions of dollars on specialists, flown Emma across oceans to visit renowned clinics, sat through endless consultations with neurologists, therapists, and child psychologists. None had succeeded in bringing back her voice. His wealth, his genius in business, his reputation as an innovator, all had failed him in the one arena that mattered most. And now this woman, this caretaker he had mistrusted from the moment she stepped into his home, had given Emma something untested, something crude, something that belonged to a world Carter prided himself on having risen above. And yet, impossibly, his daughter had spoken. The words still echoed in his ears, fragile and trembling, but undeniably real. Maya. It was not his name. It was not Daddy. It was the name of a stranger, a woman he had nearly thrown onto the street. For a man who built his empire on control, the loss of authority stung worse than anything. His pride wrestled with disbelief, his anger clashing with the sudden, desperate hope he refused to admit. He tightened his grip on Emma, who still looked over his shoulder toward the door where Maya had disappeared. Carter's jaw clenched, his thoughts a storm of contradictions. Maya's retreat upstairs. Maya closed the door to her small guest room, leaning against it as though she could physically block out the humiliation she had endured downstairs. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, the ache in her ribs sharpening each breath, but the wound to her spirit cut deeper than any bruise. She had survived humiliation before. She had endured being spoken over in medical conferences, endured the polite smiles that masked suspicion when she entered hospital boardrooms, endured the whispered comments about her background, her neighborhood, her skin. But this, being shoved like an intruder in the very house where she had poured out her care and tenderness for a child, this threatened to reopen scars she thought she had managed to hide. Her eyes drifted to the half-packed suitcase in the corner. When she had accepted this position, she had promised herself it would be temporary, a stepping stone until she figured out how to rebuild her life after her career had been torn from her. But Emma had changed that. The child had burrowed her way into Maya's heart with quiet eyes and silent trust. Every day spent together had been a reminder of why Maya had entered medicine in the first place. Not for recognition or prestige, but to bring light to children hidden in shadows of fear and illness. Walking away now, with Emma finally breaking her silence, felt like abandoning a battle just when victory was within reach. Yet she had no choice. Carter's words had been final. "Pack your things." She lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, her body weary but her mind restless. Emma's small voice haunted her, the way her lips had formed the syllables as though reaching through 2 years of silence to grasp at a lifeline. Maya closed her eyes, fighting back tears. She told herself she should be proud, that even if she were forced to leave, she had accomplished something no one else had. But pride was a thin shield against the ache of loss, the billionaire's dilemma. Meanwhile, Carter paced his private study, the vial now set on his desk like a cursed relic. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, though the drink did little to calm the unrest twisting in his chest. The truth was unavoidable. Emma had spoken. For months he had resigned himself to a life of specialists' platitudes, empty reassurances, and fruitless therapies. He had braced for the possibility that his daughter might never speak again. And then, without warning, a caretaker, one he had nearly dismissed countless times, had unlocked something in her. He hated that it wasn't him. He hated that it wasn't the world's most expensive doctors or therapists. He hated that it was someone he had dismissed as unqualified, someone he had insulted and shoved to the ground. Pride and guilt battled inside him, each clawing at his resolve. Carter was not a man who apologized easily. The very word felt foreign in his mouth, but as he replayed Emma's small voice in his mind, he felt the first cracks in the fortress of arrogance he had built around himself. Emma, tucked into bed for the night, had refused to let go of the small blanket Maya had given her weeks earlier. Carter had tried to replace it with something more luxurious, but Emma had clung to the old fabric with quiet determination. He watched her sleep, her chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to imagine a future where her voice filled the halls again. But that future impossibly seemed tied to Maya, the very woman he had ordered to leave. Emma's silent bond as dawn crept over the estate. Emma awoke to find Maya absent from her morning routine. Normally Maya would be the one to braid her hair gently, humming softly even if Emma never responded. She would be the one to coax her to eat breakfast, sitting patiently until Emma lifted her spoon. But that morning the seat beside her was empty, and Emma's small hands fidgeted with unease. She glanced at her father, who sat across the table with his tablet, scanning emails with the intensity of a man who preferred data to emotion. Emma's lips trembled, but no sound came. Her eyes darted toward the staircase, silently searching for Maya. Carter noticed his chest tightening at the look of loss on his daughter's face. He set his tablet down, forcing a smile that felt awkward and unfamiliar. "Emma, sweetheart," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Maya won't be joining us this morning. She's leaving." The girl's hazel eyes widened, her hand clutching the silver spoon until her knuckles paled. For a moment Carter thought she might cry, but instead she pressed her lips together and turned her gaze back to her plate, her silence heavier than words. He felt an unexpected pang of guilt, sharper than he cared to admit. His daughter had spoken for the first time in years, and now he was tearing away the very person who had made it possible. Maya's flashback upstairs. Maya folded her last blouse into the suitcase, her mind drifting once again to her years at the hospital. She remembered the first child she had treated as a resident, a boy with severe asthma, who had feared every doctor until she knelt on the floor beside his bed and let him hold her stethoscope. She remembered the countless nights she stayed past her shift, sitting with children whose parents were too exhausted to remain. And she remembered the day it all ended, the disciplinary hearing, the cold stares of her supervisors, the mother's false accusation echoing like a gavel striking. "You were too rough," they had said. "You scared my child, no evidence, no proof. Just a convenient excuse to remove a doctor who made donors uncomfortable." They had suspended her license pending investigation, but no investigation ever came. Months passed. Her appeals went unanswered. Her career crumbled, and in the silence that followed she had felt as voiceless as Emma. The memory made her grip the edge of her suitcase, her knuckles whitening. She had promised herself never to kneel again, never to let anyone strip her dignity a second time. But Emma had changed that. The child's trust had been a balm to wounds she thought would never heal. Leaving now felt like abandoning not just Emma but herself. The echo of a name as Maya lifted her suitcase and opened the door. A faint sound drifted down the hallway. Maya. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned, her eyes widening. At the far end of the corridor stood Emma, her tiny frame dwarfed by the grand staircase behind her. The child's lips trembled, but her eyes glowed with determination. "Maya," she repeated, louder this time, her voice quivering but clear. Maya froze, tears pricking her eyes. She had dreamed of hearing that voice, but not like this, not as a farewell. She set the suitcase down slowly, her heart pulling her toward the child even as her mind warned her of Carter's wrath. At that moment, Carter appeared at the top of the staircase, his expression torn between shock and disbelief. He had heard it too, the unmistakable sound of his daughter's voice breaking through 2 years of silence like sunlight piercing clouds. The breaking point. The 6th day of Maya's trial dawned heavy with tension. Carter had spent the night pacing his study, torn between the urge to send her away and the undeniable truth of Emma's transformation. He had witnessed the progress with his own eyes. His daughter, once a ghost drifting through his mansion, was now a child again, fragile but awakening. She had spoken new words: light, song, book, even daddy. though the last had been whispered hesitantly, as though the word itself was uncertain in her mouth. The moment should have filled him with joy, but instead it unsettled him, for it was followed by her soft murmur of Maya, spoken with far greater clarity and conviction. Carter could not ignore what that meant. Emma's trust was rooted not in him, but in the woman he had tried to drive away. On that sixth evening, the fragile balance snapped. Emma had been coaxed by Maya into reading aloud a short phrase from a picture book, her voice trembling but audible. Carter, who had been standing in the doorway, could not contain the storm inside him any longer. He stepped into the room, his voice sharp, cutting through Emma's progress like a blade. "Enough!" The child flinched, retreating into Maya's side, her lips snapping shut. Carter's face was flushed with frustration, his fists clenched. "This is not progress, it's manipulation. You are feeding her dependence on you, making her believe she cannot speak without you holding her hand." Maya rose slowly, her hand still protectively on Emma's shoulder. Her voice was calm, but steel laced her words. "I am not making her dependent, Mr. Langston. I am giving her safety. When she is ready, her voice will belong to her, not to me. But right now she needs trust, not fear." Carter's pride bristled at her quiet defiance. He wanted to shout, to reassert his authority, but the sight of Emma's trembling body stopped him. He turned away abruptly, his jaw tight, and stalked from the room. Behind him, Emma whispered her caretaker's name once more, her voice small but steady. "Maya." It was not just a word. It was a declaration of loyalty. And Carter knew it, a father's confession that night. Carter sat alone in the master bedroom, staring at a framed photograph of his late wife. In it, she was laughing, her hair caught in the wind, Emma clinging to her hand with a smile so wide it lit her whole face. The memory hit him with brutal force, and for the first time in years, his iron control cracked. He spoke into the silence, his voice hoarse. "She doesn't look at me that way anymore. Not since you left." His hand tightened around the glass frame. "I don't know how to reach her. I thought money, security, walls, those would protect her. But all I've done is make her afraid. And now she looks at that woman as though she's the one keeping her alive." He set the photograph down and covered his face with his hands, shoulders shaking. Pride had been his shield for so long that he barely knew how to live without it. But now it felt like armor that was crushing him from the inside. He was losing the one person who mattered most. Not because of illness or tragedy this time, but because of his own inability to let down his guard. The seventh day, the final day of Maya's trial, arrived like a judgment. Carter called Maya and Emma into the drawing room, his expression carved from stone. Emma clutched Maya's hand, sensing the tension, her eyes wide and anxious. Carter's gaze lingered on his daughter before shifting to Maya. "It has been a week," he said, his voice steady but cold, "and I cannot deny the progress. Emma is speaking again. For that, I will not dismiss you. You may remain, for now." Maya inclined her head slightly, though her face remained calm. She did not thank him, for she knew this was not generosity but reluctant acknowledgement. "Emma's healing is not measured in weeks," she said gently. "It is a journey, one that requires patience." Carter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His eyes drifted to Emma, who surprised them both by stepping forward. Her lips trembled, but she forced out a single word, soft yet clear. "Daddy." The sound pierced Carter's heart, unraveling him in an instant. His knees nearly buckled, and for the first time, tears burned his eyes in front of his daughter. He bent down, arms trembling as he reached for her. Emma hesitated, then stepped into his embrace, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Over her shoulder, Carter met Maya's gaze. For a fleeting moment, the walls between them thinned, and he saw not an intruder, not a threat, but a woman who had given his daughter back her voice. He wanted to thank her, but the words stuck in his throat. Pride still clung to him, but deep inside he knew a war had begun, not against Maya, but against himself. The ultimatum Carter Langston was not accustomed to indecision. In his world, hesitation meant weakness, and weakness meant loss. He had built his empire by making swift decisions that others feared to make, by stepping into chaos and bending it to his will. But in the days that followed Emma's whispered words, he found himself hesitating in ways that unsettled him deeply. Every time he entered a room and saw his daughter glance instinctively toward Maya, every time he heard the fragile syllables of her name spoken with growing clarity, he felt both awe and resentment. Maya was giving Emma something that no one else had managed to provide, and Carter could not decide whether to see that as salvation or threat. Finally, one evening, after watching Emma cling to Maya's hand during supper, Carter summoned his pride and made a decision. He called Maya into the study once more, his voice clipped, his tone sharp. When she entered, standing tall though her posture betrayed the fatigue of constant scrutiny, he did not bother with pleasantries. He leaned against the desk, arms crossed, and said, "You have 1 week. 1 week to show me that this progress isn't coincidence. If Emma continues to improve, you stay. If not, you leave this house and never return." Maya held his gaze, her dark eyes calm but resolute. "I am not here to prove myself to you, Mr. Langston," she said softly, though her words carried weight. "I am here because Emma needs someone who will not give up on her. But if 1 week is what you allow, then 1 week is what I will take." She turned to leave, but Carter's voice stopped her. "And understand this," he added coldly. "You are not her mother. You will never be her mother. Don't mistake her dependence on you for anything permanent." Maya froze for a heartbeat, then inclined her head. "I know who I am," she replied, her voice steady. "And Emma knows it too." With that, she left the study, leaving Carter standing in the heavy silence of his own making. Emma's growing voice. The week that followed became a battlefield of hope and pride, though no one dared to name it as such. Each day, Emma's progress astonished the household staff. She began murmuring simple words during her lessons. Book, song, light. She giggled softly when Maya tickled her under the chin, a sound so unexpected that the maids paused in their chores just to listen. Slowly, the house that had been cloaked in silence for years began to hum with life again, as though Emma's fragile voice was awakening something dormant in the walls themselves. Maya approached each day with patience and creativity, weaving healing into play. She taught Emma songs where each verse ended with a word the child could finish. She encouraged her to tell stories with dolls, whispering voices for each character until Emma began to mimic them. And she listened, always listened, when Emma tried to shape words, never correcting harshly, never rushing her. Progress was measured not in leaps but in steady steps, each one precious and hard-won. Carter observed all of this with conflicted eyes. He wanted to celebrate, wanted to lift his daughter into his arms and thank Maya for unlocking the miracle he had prayed for. But each time he opened his mouth, pride closed it again. He told himself that Maya was a temporary presence, that Emma's progress would have come eventually, that this caretaker was not indispensable. Yet the evidence before him grew harder to deny, and with each whispered Maya, his authority felt more tenuous. Carter's jealousy was not an emotion Carter often acknowledged. In the corporate world, envy was for those who lost, for those who watched from the sidelines. He had always been the man others envied, the one who stood on the mountaintop while rivals scrambled below. But jealousy now crept into his heart like a poison, subtle and corrosive. It was not directed at wealth or power, but at something far more intimate, the bond between his daughter and another woman. One afternoon, he walked into the garden and found Emma sitting in Maya's lap beneath the willow tree. The child's head rested against Maya's chest as the caretaker read softly from a worn children's book. Emma's lips moved silently, mouthing words she could not yet speak aloud, her fingers tracing the illustrations on the page. When she looked up, her eyes sparkled with joy that Carter had not seen in her since before his wife's death. It should have been a moment of triumph, but instead it struck him like a blow. Emma had never looked at him that way, not since the silence began. He cleared his throat and both turned toward him. Emma's smile faltered and she tucked herself closer into Maya's arms. Carter felt the rejection like a wound, though he masked it with a cold expression. "It's time for her lessons," he said curtly. Maya rose slowly, gathering Emma by the hand, her gaze steady but unreadable. Carter watched them walk away together, his fists clenched at his sides. For the first time in his life, he wondered if all his success had come at the cost of something he could never buy back, his daughter's trust. Maya's quiet resolve. Despite the weight of Carter's ultimatum, Maya did not waver. Each morning, she rose with renewed determination, setting aside her own pain to focus on Emma's needs. She saw the progress not just in the child's voice but in her spirit, in the way Emma laughed softly when the household dog bounded into the room, in the way she pointed eagerly at flowers in the garden, in the way she reached for Maya's hand without hesitation. These were not coincidences. They were the blossoming of a child who had been locked inside herself for too long. Maya also began to notice something else, the way Carter lingered in doorways, watching but rarely engaging. He was a man at war with himself, torn between pride and love, between the image he had built and the vulnerability he feared. She did not pity him, but she understood him more than he realized. She too knew what it was to lose everything, to hide wounds beneath armor, to fear that trust would never be restored. Perhaps that was why Emma trusted her, because she carried her own silence and the child recognized it. At night, when the house settled into stillness, Maya often found herself praying. Not for her own future, but for Emma's voice to continue blooming, for Carter to see the truth his pride blinded him to, for the strength to remain in this house of contradictions. She did not know what the end of the week would bring, but she knew one thing with certainty. She would not abandon Emma no matter the cost. Maya's night of reckoning. Maya lay awake that night, long after the house had gone quiet. The heavy curtains of her room blocked out the moonlight, but her thoughts remained restless, drifting between the fragile sound of Emma's voice and the venom in Carter's words. She had expected to be dismissed, expected to carry her suitcase down the marble staircase and out into the world again with nothing but regret. Instead, Carter had offered her something she had not anticipated, a trial. He had not embraced her presence, but he had not banished her either. It was a fragile reprieve, a window through which the possibility of change flickered. Still, Maya knew that living under his scrutiny would be like walking across glass. One misstep, and she would be cut to pieces. She thought back to her childhood in the cramped apartment where her mother had raised her. Nights when money for food was scarce, her mother would brew teas from herbs passed down through generations, whispering prayers over the steaming cups. It wasn't just the liquid that healed, but the care behind it, the simple act of being seen, of being held. Maya had carried that philosophy into her medical practice. She had believed healing was as much about presence as it was about prescriptions. That belief had made her patients adore her, but it had also made her a target in a world where efficiency and hierarchy mattered more than compassion. She closed her eyes, the weight of that loss pressing down once more. Was she destined always to be seen as less, no matter how much good she did? Or could Emma's voice be proof that her methods, her care, had value after all? Emma's awakening. The days that followed revealed a change in Emma so subtle yet so profound that even the staff of the estate whispered about it in quiet astonishment. Where once the girl drifted through the halls like a shadow, she now lingered at windows, watching the world outside with newfound curiosity. She began humming, barely audible, a breath more than a sound, but it was a melody nonetheless, proof that her silence was cracking open like ice in spring. And always her eyes searched for Maya. At mealtimes, she looked toward her caretaker before lifting her spoon. At night, she refused to sleep until Maya had tucked her in. And sometimes, when the house was still, she would whisper her name again, as though practicing, as though trying to claim her voice back one syllable at a time. For Maya, each of these small victories was monumental. She began to incorporate gentle rituals into Emma's routine, soft breathing exercises disguised as games, story hours where she would pause mid-sentence and encourage Emma to fill in the blanks with gestures or murmurs, and long walks in the garden where silence was accepted but curiosity was rewarded. She never pressured, never pushed. She simply offered presence, and slowly Emma responded. Carter watched all of this with a mixture of awe and resentment. He could not deny the progress, yet every time Emma reached for Maya's hand instead of his, it cut him deeper. He had always believed his role was to provide, to protect, to build a world so secure that nothing could touch his daughter. But security had not given Emma her voice back. Maya had. And for a man who had built his empire on being indispensable, the realization was unbearable. Carter's pride and pain one evening. Carter lingered in the doorway of the music room where Maya sat with Emma at the piano. Maya's fingers moved gracefully across the keys, coaxing out a simple lullaby. Emma, sitting beside her, pressed a few notes hesitantly, her lips moving as though shaping words to match the tune. Carter felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down, unwilling to let emotion betray him. He had lost control once before, when grief had consumed him after his wife's death, and he had sworn never to let it happen again. But watching Emma with Maya chipped away at his defenses, he thought of his wife, the woman who had once filled this house with laughter and warmth. She had been the bridge between him and Emma, softening his rough edges, reminding him that love was not measured in provision alone. When she died, Carter had thrown himself into work, believing that building empires was the only way to protect what remained. But in doing so, he had left Emma adrift, her silence a mirror of the emptiness that had overtaken the house. Now Maya had stepped into that void, and Carter did not know whether to hate her for it or to thank her. The conflict tore at him each night, leaving him pacing his study like a man trapped between two truths. Pride told him to dismiss her, to reclaim control, to prove that his daughter's healing did not depend on a stranger. But love, buried deep, wounded and raw, whispered that perhaps Emma needed more than what he alone could give. And that whisper frightened him most of all. The ghost of the hospital. One afternoon, Maya received a letter slipped under her door, stamped with the emblem of the medical board. Her breath caught as she opened it, though her hands trembled so violently she could barely unfold the paper. It was not her license reinstated. That battle was still unresolved. But it was a notice of a hearing scheduled months away. A chance, however slim, to present her case again. She sat on the edge of her bed staring at the words until they blurred through her tears. The past she had tried to bury was returning, demanding she face it once more. That evening, as she braided Emma's hair before bed, Maya found herself telling the child a story. Not a fairy tale, but a memory softened into allegory. She spoke of a healer in a village who loved her patients too much, who listened to their fears and gave them comfort when others offered only remedies. One day the healer was accused of harming a child, though she had done nothing wrong. The village believed the lie, and the healer was cast out. For a long time she wandered, uncertain if she would ever heal again. But one day a child who had forgotten how to speak whispered her name, and the healer realized that perhaps her gift had not been stolen after all. Emma listened with wide eyes, and though she did not speak, she pressed her small hand into Maya's palm as if to say she understood. Maya kissed her forehead, tears burning her eyes. She did not know if she was telling the story to comfort Emma or to remind herself that she still had purpose. Perhaps it was both. The wound beneath the armor. Carter found Maya in the library later that night, sitting in the dim light with the letter open on the table before her. He picked it up without asking, scanning the words quickly. "A hearing," he muttered. "So it's true, you were a doctor once." Maya looked up sharply, her jaw tightening. "I am a doctor," she said quietly, "whether the board recognizes it or not." Carter studied her, his expression unreadable. "Why were you stripped of your license?" "Because I made people uncomfortable," she answered, her voice low but steady. "Because I cared too much. Because I spoke too boldly. Because I didn't fit the picture they wanted in their halls. One false accusation was all it took." For a moment Carter said nothing, but in his chest something shifted. He knew what it was to be judged, to be envied, to be resented for success. But he had never faced the weight of being dismissed because of who he was rather than what he had done. He placed the letter back on the table, his fingers lingering on it before he let go. "You're still on trial here," he reminded her, his voice firm though less harsh than before. "But if you can help my daughter, then maybe—" He stopped, the words catching. Carter Langston was not a man who easily conceded ground, but for the first time he left the thought unfinished, allowing possibility to hang in the air. The Golden Cage. The Langston estate stretched across rolling acres of manicured lawns, its glass walls and sharp edges gleaming under the late afternoon sun. From the outside it resembled a palace of modern wealth, sleek, impenetrable, and flawless. Inside, however, silence reigned like a monarch, heavy and suffocating. Emma Harding, a delicate 5-year-old girl with wide hazel eyes, sat curled on the edge of a velvet couch in the drawing room. Her small hands gripped the folds of her cotton dress as she stared at the pattern of light filtering through the chandelier above. She did not hum, did not babble, did not laugh. For nearly 2 years, no sound had crossed her lips, not even when the doctor shone lights in her throat or coaxed her with toys. The silence was not only in Emma. It spread through the house like mist, as though every wall had absorbed her muteness and echoed it back. Even the staff spoke in hushed tones, careful not to break the fragile atmosphere. Carter Langston, billionaire entrepreneur and tech mogul, ruled the house with precision and control. His empire of innovation, apps, artificial intelligence, self-driving technologies, was vast and admired. Yet all his billions, all his influence, could not buy the one thing he wanted most, his daughter's voice. Maya's entrance. Maya Williams entered the drawing room with steady steps, her hand carrying a small glass vial, the other resting softly on Emma's tiny shoulder. At 32, Maya had the kind of quiet strength that could fill a space without raising her voice. Her dark curls framed her face and her brown skin glowed faintly under the chandelier's light. She had been in the Langston estate for only 4 months, hired after a long procession of speech therapists, tutors, and pediatric specialists had failed. Officially, she was Emma's caretaker. Unofficially, she had become her confidant, the only adult who seemed to truly notice the girl beyond her silence. "Here, sweetheart," Maya whispered, kneeling beside Emma. "Just a sip. It's gentle. My grandmother used to make this whenever children closed themselves off from the world." The little girl blinked, hesitant, but her eyes flickered with curiosity. She reached out, tiny fingers brushing the cool glass. Maya tipped the vial carefully, letting the faintly brownish liquid touch Emma's lips. The child sipped, slow and uncertain, before settling back on the couch. "The storm, Maya." The sharp voice cut through the air like glass shattering on marble. Carter Langston stormed into the room, his tall frame commanding immediate attention. Impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his tie loosened just enough to hint at a long day. He exuded the kind of authority that made even his boardroom rivals flinch. His dark eyes fixed on the vial in Maya's hand, fury igniting. "Are you insane? Are you poisoning my daughter?" The words crashed through the room, rattling the silence. Emma flinched, shrinking into the corner of the couch. Maya froze, the vial still cupped gently in her hand. Carter crossed the room in long, purposeful strides, snatching the bottle from her grasp. He held it up to the light, his jaw tight. "What the hell is this?" he growled. "What did you just give her?" Maya rose slowly, palms trembling. "Sir, it's not dangerous, I swear. She was dehydrated. She hasn't eaten or drunk all day." You thought. His voice dripped with sarcasm, sharp and mocking. "You thought you could feed my daughter some voodoo potion from your ghetto pantry?" The word stung, but Maya held her ground. "It's a family remedy. Natural, gentle. It's helped children with trauma before. My mother, your mother?" Carter spat the word like poison. "Oh, wonderful. A backwoods recipe passed down from swamp healers. That's supposed to comfort me." The fall Emma whimpered softly, clutching the hem of Maya's sleeve. Carter noticed the gesture and his fury boiled over. He lunged forward, shoving Maya backward. Her back hit the edge of a polished side table with a sickening thud before she collapsed onto the marble floor. Pain radiated through her ribs as her palms scraped against the cold tiles. Her vision blurred, but not just from the impact. Humiliation burned hotter than the pain. "You stay away from my daughter," Carter roared. "You filthy fraud. I should have known better than to let someone like you into this house." Maya gasped, fighting for breath, her chest heaving. She tried to rise, but the ache in her back forced her still. Her dignity felt crushed beneath Carter's boots, literally and figuratively. Carter scooped Emma into his arms, muttering, "Daddy's here." But his grip was rough, far from tender. Emma did not resist, though her eyes darted back to Maya, shimmering with confusion and fear. Maya's memories, as Carter turned to leave. Maya's mind yanked her backward. Street Adelaide Children's Hospital. White walls, bright lights. A younger Maya in a white coat, Dr. Maya Williams, pediatrician, brilliant, loved by patients, but resented by certain colleagues who whispered behind closed doors. One false accusation. Too rough with a child during a routine checkup. No evidence. Just whispers in boardrooms. Donors uncomfortable with her presence. Suddenly, "We've decided to suspend your license until further notice." They never said it was about race. They never said it was about her confidence, her brilliance, her refusal to bow her head. But she knew, and it had broken her. Emma's first word back in the present, Maya pushed herself to sit. Teeth gritted against the pain. "Mr. Langston," she croaked. He stopped. Turning halfway, Emma clutched in his arms. He said nothing. Maya forced her trembling voice steady. "I wasn't trying to defy you. I wasn't playing doctor, I just wanted to reach her." "You've lost that privilege," Carter growled. "Pack your things. You're lucky I don't call the police." Emma stirred in his arms. Her lips parted. A faint, fragile sound slipped out. Carter froze. "What did you say?" he whispered. Emma blinked, her small voice trembling again. Maya. For nearly 2 years, not a single sound. 2 years of specialists, therapies, countless failed attempts. And now her first word, spoken not to her father, not to a doctor, but to Maya. Carter turned his head sharply toward Maya. She said nothing. Her lips pressed together, holding back tears. Emma whispered again, clearer this time. Maya. Maya did not move. Her back ached, her pride stung, but her dignity remained. I'll get my things, she said quietly, rising with what strength she had left. She turned and walked away, leaving behind silence, the kind that did not comfort but unsettled, a silence waiting to be broken again.